Okay, so welcome back to the final session today. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Simon Caney. I said at the beginning of this event yesterday that there were a handful of people who had really, led the way in mapping out, the field of climate justice and climate ethics, and that Henry was one of them, and we're incredibly privileged to have another one of them here today. So Simon's work on climate justice and global justice has really done that kind of work with respect to the field of climate justice overall. And perhaps unusually as well, and remarkable, is that for someone who is such a good philosopher, he's also, really directly engaged with the world of climate policy. So having written reports for the Mary Robinson Foundation and Oxfam and the World Bank and the Nuffield Council on Biofuels. Is that
Bioethics.
Right? Bioethics, right? Okay. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Simon.
Well, thank you very much for that generous welcome and for the invitation. And as others have said, kudos to the Leverhulme for sort of funding and initiating this great centre. So many thanks to you, Catriona, and to Chucks. Is it okay if I sit? Okay. So this normally whirs around, but I thought this was, and apologies because some of you, especially like Henry, have seen this multiple times, but I think it's a useful framing device because there are people who are very knowledgeable about climate change in the room and others for whom it's not their primary focus. And this is from Climate Prediction Net, set up by people like Miles Allen at Oxford and Dave Frame, who was at Oxford. And it was modelling what it is required to meet the 2-degree target. And they ask, if you want a 50% chance of meeting the 2-degree target, humanity can emit roughly 1 trillion tons of carbon. We set aside other greenhouse gases. So think of 1 trillion tons. Now, given our current usage, we've used about this much. As I say, normally it's whirring around furiously. Maybe they're recalibrating it for 1.5. At this rate, come 2040, that's when the 1 trillionth ton will be emitted. So on their model, and they're going to say, look, everything is rough and approximate, so it's not literally Saturday the 22nd of December. But that's the time frame that we should be thinking about, and we have this budget. And incidentally, if you think that 50% chance of avoiding a 2-degree increase is a way too high a gamble for a too unambitious target, I would agree. So that would make it even more stringent. So I just think that's a useful framing device to put things in context. At this point, I'm going to ask Anne if I could have my PowerPoint. So, my aim in this is to start with some philosophical principles about justice in the context of climate change and get more and more applied. And I wanted to do it in 3 components. So I say a little bit about how I think we should think about the principles that should apply to issues like climate change. Then I want to say, well, what implications does this really have for policy? So Sonia earlier was making the point that people really need to think very hard about particular policies and institutions and what it really means on the ground to apply principles of justice. So I want to say a little bit about how I think principles of justice can and do inform that, and give 1 or 2 examples. And then the third thing I wanted to do is, I suppose it's born out of a little bit of an exasperation that people often have these ethical principles and they often come up with wonderful policies, and then they say, come on, this should happen. And it strikes me as unutterably naive if we really need to think about the politics and the political institutions. And the way that political institutions are set up domestically and at the global level are not well equipped to realise climate justice and indeed other issues of global and intergenerational justice. So I think it's mission incomplete if you just come up with some policies or some principles. You really need to think about the institutional architecture, because without that we're not being serious. So I will say some things about institutional architecture And I mean, it fits in comments made in the earlier keynote today about short-termism, about rethinking the decision-making process. So this is going to be the quite abstract bit, and then hopefully it'll get more concrete. So I think there's two guiding sets of issues we need to consider. And one of them is, what's the just target that we should be aiming for? So by that I mean for the just target for mitigation policies, for adaptation policies, what is it that we should be aiming to get out of this? And the second question is about the journey from here to there, and who should enjoy the burdens or indeed any of the benefits that come out of that process. And so that's what I'm calling this second principle, and the first one is about the just target. So now the just target has been discussed a bit already at this conference, and Darrell was raising questions about the 1.5 target. The way I think about it is as follows. I mean, the UNFCCC starts with this phrase about it being dangerous anthropogenic interference. And notions of danger are inherently normative. You cannot have an account of dangerous climate change without some ethical values informing it in some way. I mean, even if someone gives an economic analysis, they're just assuming that that is the appropriate ethical framework for thinking about what counts as dangerous. And when you look at the 2-degree target, the history by which it came about does not lead me to think this is the ideal target. So my reading of the history, and I've put some of the sources here, is that William Nordhaus put it as a sort of a heuristic in one of his early papers, saying, well, if it were 2 degrees, then we should do this. He was not endorsing it. The European Council of Ministers in 1996 came up with it, and then it sort of solidified. But there's lots of questions you can ask. You can ask, should we have a temperature target at all? Because, you know, a global mean temperature target covers massive disparities of temperature across the globe. You might think that we should just look at some other metric, such as overall damages, and then look at other kinds of issues like the forcing. So I was pleased then that there are debates about 1.5 were being pushed by some, like the small island states, because it struck me that 2 degrees was sort of a somewhat complacent target. If you looked at IPCC data, at 1 degree there's harm, at 0.7 of a degree it's harm. So it seems to me unhelpful just to sort of assume 2 degrees and then work with that. But my question is, well, how do we figure out what counts then as dangerous? So, you know, I'm afraid the only way I think you can think about this is to engage in some philosophical considerations, and you'd have to do at least 2 things. One is you'd have to figure out what the metric is that you care about, and the other is you'd have to have a distributive principle. Now, I realise to non-philosophers this might seem, you know, ridiculously abstract, but let me illustrate. So one metric of what matters is welfare as measured by willingness to pay. Now, those who followed the IPCC process will know that in 1995, the second assessment report, there was massive controversy because a willingness to pay criterion was used to assess the value of a human life, and it comes out that a Bangladeshi is worth 1/17 of a North American citizen's life because of the willingness to pay criterion. So these may sound like the dry things that philosophers get excited by but don't have any practical purchase. They have practical purchase. Similarly, if you care about GDP, if that's your metric as to what matters, that's not going to pick up various things like the loss of eco-services that just cannot be priced. So you need to have some account of the good that you think is being protected, and you need to have an account of how much it should be protected. And I think this plays quite an influential role. So some people think, like my colleague John Broome, I think most economists think, that they define dangerous climate change as that level at which you would get more benefit than cost if you prevented it. But that might tolerate quite a lot of damage. I mean, it's basically a utilitarian criterion. Others, I've done this myself, defend a human rights approach, which has a much lower, much more stringent account of what really matters. Some others, like my friend there, Darrell, has proposed an alternative to a human rights one and said we should think of dangerous climate change in terms of the anti-poverty principle. I mean, I think that's too narrow myself. I think that forcible displacement should count as a malign effect of climate change, even if people are not impoverished. I mean, of course they often are impoverished, but my worry about that is it's too narrow. But, you know, it's along, I think, similar lines to what I would argue for. So my first claim then is it's inherently normative, and you have to get your hands dirty and think about some of these. Second claim is people often talk about dangerous climate change as if there's just one phenomenon. I think there's at least three things that the word or the phrase dangerous climate change can mean, and it's really important to bear in mind what they mean. So one is what I call the moral ideal standard. So imagine in 1990 when the first assessment report came out, or let's say 1995 when it seemed like there was much more stronger confidence that there was human agency behind climate change. Suppose countries like the US had taken the appropriate action. What should the target have been then? You know, maybe it should have been like a 1-degree target. So that's like the ideal. It's what would the target now be if people had done what they should have done before? I think it's really important to know that, because otherwise when people make these commitments and when they perhaps achieve them, they might think, oh, we've achieved a just world. And I want to say, no, you haven't. Those whose land has been ruined by salination, those who've been forcibly displaced, those who've died because of hunger, who needn't have if you had acted properly earlier, those all have claims of injustice, and they're entitled to compensation, you know, if they're alive and if it's possible. So although I think people will dismiss the first as well, it's utopian, it doesn't really matter, I think it matters for two reasons. One is it's true, people have been treated unjustly, and secondly, it gives grounds for compensation. So I think that might choose a really low target. Then there's another one, which is, okay, well, there's nothing you can do about the non-compliance in the past, but what is the lowest reasonable target people could attain now given past non-compliance? And so someone looking at that data I gave earlier about the trillion ton, and they look at there being about 0.4 of a trillion tons, might say, well, you know, empirically the thing that's possible to achieve is 1.5. And then they should think dangerous climate change is defined in terms of what could we actually achieve if we pulled out all the stops now. That's the second criterion. But I think there's also a third version, which I was alluding to earlier today when discussing with Pat and with Darrell, which is, what are the things you think should be institutionalized in the international negotiations? Because it's a very common observation amongst political philosophers that just because you think X is good or X is right does not mean you think it should be institutionalized in the legal and political process. Why might you not do that? I mean, let me just give you some examples not to do with climate change. You might think someone has a right to euthanasia, but you don't want to put it into law because you think it will be abused. You might think that in some fantastical scenario, torture could possibly be justified if in a philosophy seminar where all the conditions are met and you have perfect knowledge. But you might think, I will never ever want a law allowing it because you fear abuse. And that's because of institutionalization. And I think institutionalization has several other sort of dimensions, and partly it's a political phenomenon. So as I said this morning, I think there are three things that should inform this, that should play no part of those others. So one thing that should inform this is the aspirational kind of dimension. Does it motivate people? Does it incentivize them to do the best? The second is the credibility one. If you put in, like, say 1.1, suppose 1.1 is physically attainable. If you put that in there, I imagine some people will think, you're having a laugh, it's unattainable, you lose credibility. So the second ingredient then is credibility. And the third one is possibilities for abuse. And so the reason why people might think someone has a right to euthanasia but they don't want a law allowing it is because they think it might be abused. And so you might worry that putting something in a legal framework permits abuse, or it ties people's hands for the future, which was the way Darrell was putting it, or it commits you to things you just may want to pause about. And the thing about this is all kinds of political considerations should inform this. And so even if you think the science dictates for this and for that, really low targets, it doesn't follow that it should be low here. There's another point that Tara made to me before, which is you might care about who is saying what in this process. So the 1.5 target came about because of most vulnerable states and coalitions like AOSIS. And you might think there's special reason to give extra weight to their point of view if they're fighting hard for this. So this is all just a very long way of saying there's different ways of defining dangerous climate change, and they're all perfectly valid. I don't think we should give up on each of them, but we shouldn't confuse them. So they perform different functions. The first one tells you the truth. The second one gives you a benchmark by which to judge all current and future conduct. And the third one is what should guide our political deliberations. And you should really assess the third one in light of the second. Now, I've gone on about this because I really think it matters what our target is. People's livelihoods are at stake. In some ways, I think of defining it. Don't pay attention to the human cost and the human loss. So at the very least, we need to be much more explicit and conscious about the ethical framing. Okay, so that sums up where I've got so far. Let me turn to the other side. So suppose you have like a 1.5 degree target or some other target. There's familiar issues concerning, concerning the allocation of responsibilities. And this has been covered quite a lot already, and so I don't want to say too much more about it. We're familiar with the question about differentiation. We're familiar with the emphasis on the right to develop. What I do want to say is that there are elements that sometimes get overlooked and that are nicely picked up in the Paris Agreement. So just burden sharing isn't, I think, just to do with who does how much mitigation or how much adaptation. It's also the constraints on how people do mitigation and how they do adaptation. There are very harmful ways of doing mitigation and adaptation that impose unjustified harms on other people. There are ways of designing emissions trading schemes, for example, that are regressive, and we should bear that in mind when considering the implementation of any emissions trading scheme. There are carbon taxes which will cause fuel poverty, and therefore you might have a slightly tragic choice of, do you have a carbon tax and reduce emissions, or do you prioritize those who are in fuel poverty? So these are the kinds of issues that I think this principle picks up. It's not just about how much you mitigate, it's also about these side constraints. The final point I want to make about the framework, so imagine you have your target, whatever it is, and imagine you have your account of how responsibilities ought to be allocated. The final thing I want to say is you've got to consider these together. You can't do them separately, because suppose someone has a super ambitious target, it might just impose excessive burdens on others, especially in conditions of non-compliance. And I think this was what was driving Darrell's concern this morning, that the cost in transition to some people might be so high that it calls into question the appropriateness of a target. And I think this is especially acute when there's non-compliance. So if the EU and North America don't do it, and the only way to get to 1.5 is by some developing countries taking on even more burdens, then you have to ask the question, well, which do you prioritize? The other reason I think you can't do them separately is I do think your answer to one question will guide the other. So if you think, I really care about preventing dangerous climate change, because people have a right to develop and it's destructive of that, when you do burden sharing, you've got to respect the right to develop. You can't say, and therefore we'll have all these mitigation responsibilities that fall on developing countries. So the same reason applies in both. So this is my way of saying you really need a very integrated approach that has a general vision. And so I endorse then what this morning Yuba was saying about the right to develop, and putting development as the core both tells you why you need to mitigate and adapt, but also guides the allocation of responsibilities too. I also want to push, in my more maximal moods, to an equal world. And if you're an egalitarian at the global level, as I am, then that should inform both the target you're aiming for and the allocation of responsibilities. So that's the more abstract philosophical bit. Let's talk about policies then. And someone from the policy world might think, well, what on earth does, can I do with this? What relevance does this have? I think often these principles can serve as side constraints. What political philosophers can say in these cases is, look, there's a whole lot of economic policy instruments at your disposal. You can have carbon taxes, you can have quantity systems, you can have upstream auctions, you can have personal carbon cards, you can have other kinds of emissions trading schemes, you can have this kind of, you can decide. But you must honour these two constraints. They must make a positive contribution to mitigating climate change and furthering adaptation, and they must distribute burdens equitably and not impose unjust harms. And here's a list of cases where I do think there's a risk that the policies do impose harms or can do. So carbon taxes, as I mentioned, these can lead to fuel poverty. Now, one response that is very common is people can say, oh, look, we just find out who has fuel poverty and we'll compensate them. But when I spoke to people who work on the social policy, they say it's just remarkably hard to identify who suffers from fuel poverty. They're not geographically concentrated. So you have a choice there. Which one do you do? Take emissions trading schemes. Cameron Hepburn, I remember arguing that in practice these have been regressive. Take RED, accusations that this has led to displacement from land. Take hydroelectric, again an issue where people have been forcibly displaced, and although the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil project was begun way before climate issues, there are ongoing debates there about indigenous peoples, about forced relocation. Take feed-in tariffs. They sound a great thing, but in the UK what it happened was that the poorest people were subsidising the wealthy, because the wealthy could afford to buy into the system, and then they got compensation, but they got compensation from the general taxpayer, who included those who were unable to buy into the system. So the point is, I think, say human rights configure as a side constraint and say, look, there's lots of policy options. You choose whatever you think is most efficient or cost effective, but you must do so in a way that doesn't compromise human rights or basic ethical principles. How am I doing for time?
You're fine.
Okay. Okay, good. So that's a rather negative one, though. I mean, I think it's nicely permissive, but it's negative. Here's here's an example from, Catriona mentioned the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and this was something I worked on with some plant scientists and lawyers and economists and innovation experts, where we looked at biofuel production and ways in which sometimes it led to human rights violations, other times in which that could be avoided. So that was an attempt to put this stuff into practice. But the thing I wanted to move on to after that was, I don't think we should just think of these ethical principles as side constraints. I think they give us reason to put our weight behind certain types of positive proposal that are nascent but haven't really been developed. And the proposal I have in mind is based on work by people like Thomas Pogge on the Health Impact Fund. And in case some of you don't know that, or many of you don't know that, the starting point is this, that there's a global disease burden. Pharmaceutical companies don't have much of an incentive to produce cures for those who suffer from the global disease burden, because these people don't have money. So we need some way of incentivizing people to produce pharmaceuticals for those who can't pay. So why not have an intellectual property regime that rewards people on the basis of developing medicines for the global poor, and then they will be remunerated by sort of a revenue stream. And you could do it, let's say, if you had an upstream emissions trading stream. You know, you auction off emissions, you have some money you could use similarly to do this for clean technology. And my reasoning here is this. Thinking about development again, we have 1.8 billion people on this planet who lack access to electricity. They should be increasing energy use and given access to energy. We have that framing I began with, the 500 billion or less tons of carbon. So we have a limited budget there. And we have people such as maybe many of us in this room who are not going to dramatically reduce their consumption. So this is from the IPCC. This is conveying in words what that image from climateprediction.net was saying. So it's saying we have about 500 billion tons of this budget has been emitted. So that was in AR5. So if we have this justified demand by the global poor, if we have this limited budget, and if we have a fairly intransigent group of people who are not going to reduce their emissions, we desperately need clean technology. And I can't see any reason then to dissent from that we need to design the intellectual property regime in ways that incentivize the production of clean energy and its diffusion and its transfer to the global poor. So there's some lawyers present. I always say this when there are lawyers present. I really think this is something that lawyers can do and help design an intellectual property regime or lobby for it that somehow incentivizes the production. So it designs the patent system, let's say, so that it benefits the world as a whole or the least advantaged. And I think this just follows from what I've said so far. We have these strong obligations, people have these rights to develop. We have taken the option available to them often to develop because we've used up, many of us, the greenhouse budget. We have a responsibility as a matter of justice then to help incentivize an alternative. Okay, let me now give a third kind of policy-related example, and this is something I've been working on recently. So my first point then about policies was, I think, principles of justice can act as constraints. My second one was, if you're animated by these principles of justice, it seems very hard for me to think that you shouldn't be behind what I call that clean energy proposal. But my third case is where I think there's a really important ethical issue, and many people don't really seem to be thinking about it. It makes me nervous that I am, because I think maybe I've missed something. So I just want to share with you some thoughts in a kind of speculative nature about something that seems to be vitally important, that concerns climate and development. So the starting point is this. We have way too many fossil fuels on this planet that are accessible. If we had less, we'd be running out, we'd find other energy sources. So look at these figures from the IEA that I've put in there on the number of barrels of oil in proven reserves. What are we going to do with it? Okay. Where is it? Well, Nigeria, Angola, both, on the Human Development Index, low down on the score. So these are poor countries, very rich in fossil fuel reserves. Look at somewhere like Ecuador, which is halfway up, so 98th. But look how dependent Ecuador is on selling its petrol revenues. So 26% of government revenues, 54% of total exports coming from selling petrol. I think there's an issue of justice to do with extraction here then. So we should look not just at the consumer end, not just at the construction end, but the extraction of fossil fuels. Why? Well, here's one pragmatic thought. The pragmatic thought is we could have tough mitigation policies in this country and in the EU. We could price carbon. But two things happen there. One is people just impoverish those who are dependent on exporting oil, and they get no compensation for that. Or they just sell it to other countries that don't implement aggressive mitigation policies. So why not focus, I never know if it's upstream or downstream, but I'm going to call it upstream, right to where it comes, and think about the principles of justice that apply there. And I think there's two options that we can consider. One is we grant privileged extraction rights to developing countries that are rich in fossil fuel reserves. There are going to be lots of complicated issues there. It's going to depend on which fossil fuels, for example. Is it something dirty like coal, or is it gas? If we've got that fixed budget, we have to have that discussion, and it seems you want to really keep the coal in the ground. There are going to be issues about governance, but then there's always going to be issues about governance. You can't just treat that as a given and say, well, we're not going to have a policy with respect to the fossil fuels. So one option then is to give privileged extraction rights to countries which are low on the Human Development Index and have high fossil fuel reserves, if you think that's a way that you can get the benefits to the least advantage there. Or there's what I want to call the Yasuni ITT inspired model. And you're going to ask some of you, what is or was, status is a little unclear, the Yasuni ITT proposal. So here's an outline. In Ecuador, the Yasuni National Park has these large oil reserves with, as you can see from here, a phenomenal amount of crude oil that can make quite a significant impact. And there was a proposal in 2007 that this be kept in the ground, and it would also preserve, the biodiversity, the forestry. There's other reasons not to do with the extraction of fossil fuels. Preserve them, but they would be compensated by the international community on a voluntary basis. My understanding is in August 2013, President Rafael Correa called for drilling of oil again, and there's controversy about whether he was genuinely committed to it and so forth. But I think the bottom line was there just wasn't the money coming. But why not build on this idea? Why not have, sorry, that should say international fund, not internal. Why shouldn't there be an international Yasuni ITT fund that would do two things? It would keep fossil fuels in the ground, and it would divert resources to the least advantaged in the world. So my argument is not if you have fossil fuels and you promise you won't use them, we'll compensate you. So I'm sorry, Saudi Arabia, right? That's not the argument. The argument is if you're a developing country, you have a right to develop, but you're going to abstain from using this to develop in the interest of climate justice. You're entitled to develop, and so the world community ought to compensate. Now, apart from Yasuni, I'm unfamiliar with any other proposal of this kind, with the single exception of RED, so the reduced emissions, which is kind of analogous to. And I'd be very interested to know if people think, well, so much the worse for Yasuni, because there are lots of critics of RED, or, oh, well, I like RED, so much the better for the Yasuni. So, I'm stepping outside my comfort zone as a political philosopher and saying, it seems to me we need to think about the extraction issue. It's silly to keep plugging the holes later on. Why not tackle things right at the top of the stream? And there's a way of doing it justly that respects climate and development. Okay, so I've said a lot about policies. Hopefully those who didn't like the abstract things think, oh, I can see how it might have some purchase to the real world. Let me do the third element. Look at IPCC reports. Obviously, there's a huge amount of science in there. There is a lot of economics in there. In the last one, I was pleased to see there was some ethics in there. There's no discussion of political institutions really directly. And I think one reason for that is that political scientists haven't really discussed what political institutions are optimal for realizing climate justice. There's some great work at the international level. People like David Victor or Scott Barrett or Thomas Schelling, really rich things. But really what I'm saying now is I think we really need to look at the politics and to think about how we can reform dysfunctional political systems at the global and the domestic level to make them more climate justice friendly. And there doesn't seem to be very much work on it, so I'm making a plea. I think this is what people should work on. And I've been trying to work on this, but I'll say some ideas that I've come to. So, one aspect of this is just to latch onto Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, which talks about this process where there's this dialogue, facilitative dialogue, and a global stocktake. I think we really need to be, sorry, I've not kept up with that's the Article 14. We really need to think how to strengthen that accountability process, how to integrate it into the general political process. Sometimes I think it's a bit like what Rousseau said about democracy in Britain, that it's undemocratic every day, apart from once every 4 years, and then people have a vote. It's like climate is not on people's radar. It is, of course, for people in this room, but for most people, it barely exists. Many of people I meet have no idea what happened in Paris. They didn't really know anything about that. So we need to think of some way of making sure that the review process reaches deep down into people's lives so that they're aware. We need to encourage a process of public justification. So this has a Rawlsian tone, by which I mean those who make the decisions should be required to stand up in public and give reasons for what they're doing, to make explicit what they're doing, and basically to make things visible. Because I think climate change is in some ways an invisible problem to many people. I don't mean the impacts, I mean the energy. So people don't think that the light here, or the walls, or the heating are to do with a climate change problem. But it's everywhere, but yet invisible. And so we need to think of ways of making this visible and salient. And I think institutions play a role there. I also think language plays a role. And so the notion of rhetoric, the notion of conveying things in a way that resonates with people, is something that I think is tremendously important. And dry data that economists give and abstract principles that philosophers give don't really have the motivational oomph. So let me talk a little bit then about how we might think about doing this at the national level. I've done some work on this and for the Mary Robinson Foundation at the international level, and I think there's really important ways of improving the international process to make them more forward-looking.
10 minutes.
Lovely. That's plenty, thanks. But I want here just to say a few things that we might think about reforming domestic political institutions. So the background thoughts are, we have responsibilities to future generations. And Henry asked earlier, who's the we? So I mean you, I, me, all citizens have obligations to future generations. And with climate change, there's an intertemporal dimension, as we've already had stressed earlier today. I think there's two separate intertemporal dimensions, and one is that greenhouse gases lost a very long time, and that's the point often made. But the other is there's lock-in in terms of institutional infrastructure. So this is from AR5, the summary for policymakers. When you read it, it's perfectly obvious, but yet it gets overlooked. The way we design towns, so picking up on Sonia mentioned earlier about urban planning, has a momentous impact for decades. So someone at 2016 who gives authorization to a new runway, let's say, to choose a salient example, or who designs a certain road system, will leave an imprint on the world, for decades to come. But it's very easy to ignore that. So it's not just the greenhouse gases last a long time, it's that the choices we make create path dependencies. So how do we think about the future? Well, let me think. here are some things that have been tried, varying levels of success. Before you're too harsh on them, let me say one thing about the criterion of success. The criterion of success should not be, did this solve the problem? The criterion of success should be, did this make things any better at all, or did it make it any worse? So some people go for the constitutional entrenchment route. Some people do what Malta has done and Hungary has done, which is have ombudsmen for future generations. Some people go down the route that Wales did. So some of us were in Cardiff in April of last year when the Future Generations Act of Wales was passed, which created a Future Generations Commissioner. So there's lots of things people can do, and I think the underlying thought about this is just to make the future visible and salient to the present. And I suppose the way I would suggest thinking about these is, if you didn't care about the future, what would you do? Well, you design a system that makes no reference to the future any place whatsoever. You'd make sure you didn't have any ombudsman for the future or any future generations commissioners or any committees for the future. So by inverse, if we start thinking about these, then maybe we'll make some progress. So here I'm going to just throw out 4 or 5 suggestions that I think, in the spirit of creating institutions that are more forward-looking. One is, I think, following the Finnish example, we could make it a constitutional requirement that an incoming government issue a statement about how it's going to deal with problems in the future. So the Finnish government must, within the first year of being elected, issue a statement about what it's going to do in the future. There's one big caveat which I would dispense with. So on the Finnish one, the government can choose the topic. So that's not what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest that another body, maybe the rest of the Parliament or an independent advisory body, can say, for example, in the UK, how are you going to deal with the pensions crisis? How are you going to deal with the fact that by 2030 there's going to be something like 50% more people who are over 80 and a third more who are over 65? So they have to confront the hard questions. Why not have it built into the parliamentary process? So it's a suggestion too. That each year they must give a State of the Union speech for the future. So this is what Britain should be like in 50 years' time, or the world should be like in 100 years' time. And the idea here, again, is just to make the future visible. So people have to justify what they're doing. Look, for example, at the pensions crisis. Lots of experts were saying 10, 15 years ago, you're going to get a massive pensions crisis because people are living longer and longer. So everyone knew, the experts knew, but governments would duck it. So if you have, this is my third point, if you have a committee for the future and an independent council for the future, whose job it is to scrutinise for future impacts and to hold the government to account for what it's doing, it just makes it much harder to ignore the future. I'm trying not to sound utopian, right? I'm not saying, well, this will solve everything, this is wonderful. I'm thinking, what are the drivers of short-termism? One driver is just out of sight, out of mind. Another driver is, I only have to get re-elected next year, not in 20 years' time. Another one is just weakness of will, or procrastination, or we just might have sort of hyperbolic discount rates in the way we think. So one way to do this is just to tackle these biases. So for example, one form of procrastination, I'm sure people in this room suffer from procrastination, some of them, then is to have a plan where you're required to say exactly how you're going to do this. If you're willing the end, as Dow said earlier, you have to will the means. So if you have bodies whose job it is to say, well, for example, the UK government has made these climate change commitments, can you tell me how you're going to achieve that and how building an extra runway is going to facilitate that? Final thing, and this may sound a bit kind of policy wonky, but I think it really matters, is you have to have measures of long-term performance. So long-term performance indicators, I'll give you an example that people use in financial accounting, which is health metrics. So they say, if someone goes for a checkup, the thing you want to know how someone feels on the day, but you also want to know, are there signs that in 5 years' time or a couple of months' time, they're going to be ill. So you need health metrics as well as how are you feeling. That's fine. Okay. That's fine. So we need, so I'll just leave, wait for people to, that's fine. Nice to meet you.
No hugging during the presentation.
I'm very English. So you need criteria that are accurate at tracking long-term performance. And I just want to borrow an idea from, I think, Davis and Sokolow, what they call commitment accounting. And they're talking about this with greenhouse gas emissions. So what you do when you build, let's say, a new road, is you don't look at the amount of emissions involved in making the new road. That's not, what you need is a calculus of what extra emissions that is likely to produce in the future. So what emissions does that commit you to at T1 when you do so? About 5 minutes. And I think otherwise it's just really easy to marginalise the future, just as it is with really really high discount rates. So the fifth thought then is governments are very keen on using performance indicators with respect to academics. I think I'd like to pay them the compliment and return the compliment and say, if there's such a good idea, and there is some value to some of these ideas, governments should use ones that aren't myopic, right? And it goes back to the lock-in point. There's no point having a performance indicator that only measures what you've done at T1 if it commits you to some future ones. And the point that I take from David King and Ivor Crew is, many government departments have audit timetables that are incredibly short term, and many companies have quarterly reviews. There's no way you're going to incentivize long-term thinking if people have to be held accountable for their short-term performance. So it just seems to me if you can lengthen the audit timetable, that can only help serve the long term. So look, you know me, I'm a political philosopher. I'm not an expert on institutional design, but I want to begin the conversation about throwing out some of these ideas about how we could reform institutions. And remember, the whole point is to make them more climate justice and intergenerational justice friendly. It's based on some things I published and some work I'm doing with Dominic over there and Jaakko Kuzman. So if you think there are better ways of doing it, I'm sure we both want to hear from that. So let me wrap up. Yeah, you've had a really long talk and you've had 2 intense days. So here's from the Iroquois Nation a statement of similar kind of thoughts underlying what I've been saying recently, which is they had this rule in the constitution that united the Iroquois people, that when they made deliberations, they were required to think about the long-term impact. So you have to think about the coming generations, even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future cosmopolitan scope, not nation. And I think that's what I'm trying to suggest. We need to think of some ways of designing institutions that internalize and motivate this way of thinking. I'm not naive, right? I think people will always have self-interest. They will always have their own biases. I'm just trying to think of ways of weakening the force of them. So, what I've tried to do then is give some normative framework just to guide things and to say how it should inform things like how we choose dangerous climate change targets. I've said something about how I think this should inform policies, things like energy policy, but also emissions trading schemes and other ones, and stranding assets. And I've said something about how I think it's just unsatisfactory to leave it there. We need to think about the institutional architecture, and there's some speculative thoughts there. So thank you very much for your time.
So I think a lot of our conversations over the last couple of days have revolved around how you make theory relevant to practice. So that's just a fantastic way to end the conference. So I'll take questions. I think given time, we'll take 2 at a time. So Fergus and then Aaron.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Very little to disagree with there, but one thing I wanted to push you on a little is the
the extraction, fossil fuel extraction issue.
Right.
So what, it seems to me that you sort of, if we were to go with that, you'd be granting a kind of strong right to exploit fossil fuels, actually, rather than a right to development. And I wonder whether you're sort of going the opposite direction there than where you are in the Just Emissions paper as an integrationist. Like you say, well, what matters there is, you know, much broader thing. We don't actually need a right to emit per se. And I wonder, can't you say a similar thing here, that actually the issue might be if, you know, Ecuador or whatever stops producing fossil fuels, and then there are all of these specific problems in terms of core capabilities. But can't we address that separately rather than necessarily giving them a strong right to extract? And I think there would, I mean, I know you acknowledge there are governance problems, but I sort of do worry a bit that they might be quite serious in this. If we did go down that path of a strong right to extract, you'd have all sorts of countries claiming that their reserves, their proven reserves are bigger than what they are. And, oh yeah, we were about to create a new coal industry and give us some money. And so I think they would actually be quite salient, a lot of those problems. But I wonder if we can avoid it by being integrationists.
Can we take Aaron's question as well? Yeah.
So that was great, and as you know, I'm one of your biggest fans, but I'm going to have the opportunity to say critical things instead. Because I have two critical points. And the first is on this reform of institutions. It seems to me a lot of the work is about reform of institutions of representation.
Yeah.
And so there's some strong reforms that are about, you know, constitutional entrenchment or representatives of the future that have doubtful kind of credentials when it comes to democracy and acceptability from the public. Whereas your proposals are weaker and they're more about improving the deliberative quality. They seem to me to be quite weak and slow-moving kind of proposals. And so the challenge is, should we be looking beyond institutions of representation? So just an example, there's this debate about de-risking finance. So, you know, the governments have indicated that they want, the trillions are going to come from the private sector. And so we need to find institutional ways to de-risk that investment. And we de-risk it by saying the losers are going to get paid back through the public purse, and that's stuff we're going to get paid back by in the future. So we're putting risk onto future generations. But it just seems to me that for a fast-moving problem like this, that may be better kind of focus. And the other question, very quickly, is the same here. Isn't there a conflict between your focus on clean tech vision and paying to keep fossil fuels in the ground? Given limitations of political will, limitations of finance, you know, if we have to choose, isn't it better to choose the clean tech option so that it just becomes natural that those things stay in the ground?
Yeah, good, thank you. So Fergus, yeah, I mean, I've written a long paper for Oxfam USA on this, and I was like 18,000 words, and so it discusses that kind of issue, and I think it's wrong to say they have a right to develop using fossil fuels. I mean, yeah, I'm consistent with what I say and agree with what you say there. I suppose one slight pushback there is someone's going to use some fossil fuels. So if anyone is, can't they have a privileged claim? And the privileged claim is they haven't extracted them in the past, as others have. They haven't benefited from the extraction. But I'm totally with you. What really matters is just development. And if someone said, look, it's just better to develop in other ways, then I would have just no quarrel. I couldn't have any quarrel with that. I suspect there might be some things to do with insiders and outsiders, and so they might, you know, there's intellectual property rights issues to do with clean technology. So I can imagine a country saying, we'd rather, you know, not be dependent on your foreign technology. We'd rather use our own local things because we're not vulnerable to sort of domination by others. And if you could find some way of bypassing that, then I think, yeah, I just totally agree then that the development's the thing. On Aaron, so on representation, I suppose one thing I want to say is, look, we should just be doing lots of things. I don't think there are alternatives. In the paper that I mentioned on there, I look at some of the other ones. I'm a bit skeptical about some of the other ones that people use. So sometimes people have ideas of sort of impartial, non-democratic guardians. And I think they have this kind of assumption that most people are really myopic, but we've got this impartial group of people who like platonic guardians. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I suppose I think mine has some virtues that other ones don't. And then why can't we just combine it with what you said? One other thing I would say is that climate change is not the only issue to do with the long and the short term. So, I mean, I mentioned pensions, but I just think there's loads of problems that have a long intertemporal problem, and so we should just, that would be an extra reason for doing this as well. On integrationism, I wrote integrationism and clean tech for you. What did you say something?
No, it's about this idea of paying people to keep the fossil fuels on the ground versus focusing on clean tech and emissions.
Oh yeah, that's right. So my worry about this is just time. Right? It just takes time to have a clean energy revolution. We've got oil pouring out right now, so you could have a system where it's just weaning people off over time, or it could be you compensate Ecuador for keeping it in the ground by supplying clean tech. I suppose in my mind there's a bit of power politics element going in as well, that you need to be able to persuade people, because they might think, well, we could get really rich doing this, make it worth our while. I don't want to go too far down that route, because then of course other non-poor fossil fuel states can say something similar. So my main reason is just the time one. I just don't think we have the clean technology right here and now.
Okay, Patrick?
So I just had a comment on the exchanges about the right to extract. So I thought the clear answer to those questions is just, well, the first half of the paper was about how you can have there's what rights we have, and then there's what institutional mechanisms we put in place in order to enforce or protect rights or whatever. And your answer is you don't have the right to extract, but the mechanism by which you try and achieve that is by paying people not to do it. So that seems like that was perfectly consistent with the other parts of the paper.
Well, I had a sort of a two-pronged strategy. One was maybe developing countries have privileged extraction rights, or then there was the other one, and I think Fergus was criticising the first one. I mean,
Right.
I think, and so but I could just do the second one.
Rights, right? There's sort of question about what rights we have, and there's question about institutional mechanisms, and they're related, but they're not. You can't read one straight from the other. So that was just a comment. And my actual question was about. It's actually a sort of maybe a similar-ish point though. Was to do with, you were talking about these different kinds of targets we might have. So you say, look, here are 3 different kinds of targets, and then you said it's really important to bear in mind all of these, and they're all important, but it's also really important to be explicit about, which one we're talking about and why. And I was just slightly worried with institutional targets. It might be really important not to be explicit because it might undermine the reason that it's your institutional target but not your ideal target, whatever. So, you talked about euthanasia or torture. So, if you have a sort of public policy that says, look, we're going to ban torture. I mean, obviously we recognise that sometimes it's all right. And if the torturer hasn't read their shoe and therefore they don't know that the ticking time bomb actually doesn't really occur very often, then it might sort of undermine the very basis for which you've selected that as an institutional target. So I wondered really whether that was a problem, and also...
Can I respond to that? Because I got a bad memory, so yeah, you might be right. I mean, my main thing I wanted to say is they're different and they have different criteria. But on the other hand, the other examples I give, it's not troubling to think someone has a right to euthanasia, but then also to think it should be made illegal. There's no case for government house.
Right, so there's 2 words that were lurking in the back of my mind. But
They were, yeah.
But in this context, it might be important, right? So if you say that we've selected 1.5, we realise it's totally unfeasible, but we've put it there as a sort of aspirational goal, then that does undermine the sort of the point of selecting it, which is that it's supposed to be a goal that we recognise that we're trying to get toward. So if you're too explicit about the fact that it's merely aspirational, then it will lose all its force.
Yeah, but remember I had 3 ingredients. So the first one is the motivational signalling thing about ambition. The second one was about credibility, and then the third one was about prospects for abuse. And you're emphasising the ambition one. I think in this problem, the number of scientists and the way the world is, there'd just be no hiding the fact if you put something that's really aspirational and it's unrealistic, the word will come out straight away. So, I mean, I recognise what we are talking Sidgwick, really, aren't we? We're talking about sort of government house utilitarianism, and I can see the point that sometimes there's a case for keeping quiet. But I just think realistically that's not a live option here. I mean, climate scientists are incredibly argumentative lots who say this is just wrong and no, it's great. I mean, they're good. I don't know if there are any still here. They're great from this point of view. So any idea that there was a kind of a conspiracy amongst climate scientists is, you've not met climate scientists. They love to disagree with each other and point out flaws and errors. So I think empirically they wouldn't, but I grant that there's a government house worry in the background, and I can see what you're getting at, yeah.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions, which we'll take at once. If I could ask you to be succinct, because we do have to finish on time, and then whatever time is left, Simon, you can choose whichever one you answer, if any. Right, so we have Rob, and then Henry, and then Chooks, in that order.
So, a point about Patrick's set of concerns, it seems to me that there's an issue about authority when we're thinking about institutions, and that set of questions isn't going to be exhausted by thinking about the 3 things that you have. So, on the stuff about institutions which are supposed to help us think about our obligations to the future. So, I'd just like to know a bit more about what you think the criteria for success for those kinds of institutions are going to be. So, the only case that I can think of something like that was the Blair government's child poverty targets, where they said they were going to eliminate child poverty by some point in the future. I can't remember exactly what it was now, which is clearly now not going to be met. And it's conceivable, at least, that you could make a case that in fact that target setting was more or less entirely useless. It's not clear to me that actually postponing a goal in that kind of way was helpful. So I just wonder if you could say something about the sets of conditions under which you think that kind of having these sorts of institutions which are supposed to constrain our ability to inflict certain kinds of harms in the future are actually going to work.
Okay, if we can take Henry next.
Well, 2 points. The first is I don't wish to appear to be a promoter of ready tooth and claw capitalism, but I'm just interested in your view about the justice arguments as they apply to owners and investors and firms.
Right.
Remembering that we're not just talking about capitalists, we're talking about pension funds and insurance companies.
Yeah.
And also against the background that I have no idea what the appropriate numbers for Ecuador are, but we've been reminded that when we talk about Nigeria's oil, what we're really talking about is long-term agreements between the government of Nigeria and a variety of very large oil companies, which are usually not unfavourable to the oil companies concerned. So they would say, and it's quite interesting looking at various episodes in history where similar sorts of disappropriations have happened. Hold on, this is a government decision which actually strips a great deal of value from our business. What is this something where you can just do that? Do we have? Are we just because we're corporate rather than what? An individual or what's the barrier there? And the second point I wanted to say was just to say that I'm so delighted to see somebody focusing strongly on the discount rate. I mean, when I was civil servant first dealing with this stuff, I was utterly amazed to find that essentially there was no argument about discount rate when you started talking to the Treasury about what was the appropriate way of determining the rights and wrongs of investing in some public good in the future. It was solved. We got all the information we need about discount rates, time preference rates, and rates derived from market, particularly the bond markets. And so I was asked, well, what's your alternative? We know what the answer is. We know what people's willingness to pay is because it's out there. It happens.
Yeah.
So what's the authority of somebody who comes along and sort of says, no, I think we deserve to give more to the future that actually our actions show that we appear to want to do ourselves? What did the future ever do for me? How do you deal with it? Where do you say this is the right place and not that?
Okay, Chuck's final brief question, comment.
Right. Like I said, first question, I'm not sure the sort of distinctions you're making between Nigeria and other developed countries that have oil, insofar as the purpose of digging up the oil is to enhance the well-being and development of the countries in question. Can you clarify that distinction, because it's not clear to me? Secondly, in your previous argument, you've actually suggested that what matters is not kind of just emissions, but it's kind of the right to sustainable development. How does that argument square with now the right to extract or not, as opposed to the right, again, to well-being? And final question, where's the money going to come from? Because even RED, with all these flaws, is not at all adequately resourced.
Okay, you've got 2 minutes, Simon, so maybe you should choose which of those questions you want to.
Okay, well, I'd say to all three, thank you very much, to be continued, but to Rob, I'll send you a paper I wrote on it, and I do talk about the criteria for success there. But you could do it in a kind of procedural way. I think there's lots of cognitive failings that we have when we make decisions. And so you could do it as, is there a deliberative process that responds to some of these? But it needn't actually prescribe any particular substantive outcome. But yeah, well, I'll send you the paper and we can have a longer conversation there. I do think on the impact ones, think about the ref and the incentives to write an article versus a theory of justice, right? That's this persuades academics immediately, right? Short-term ones. My kids go to a school where two schools, and the first one assessed whether they got from here to there. The second one assessed them on how much progress they'd made. The incentives of the first school was to inflate how well they'd done. The incentive of the second school was to start, you think, and it's not just my kids, it's everyone. They sort of say, you think you were here? No, because they had to prove their value added. And the point about this tiny anecdote is just people respond to the incentive structures. And all you need to know there is if you've got children between like 7 and 14, if you design it in that way, you're just going to produce very miserable children in their first year of the second school because you've just incentivized that counterproductive one. So think of the ref, think of that example, and then think, well, could we design incentive structures that aren't so ridiculously short term? Henry, we actually met on a panel in UCL, and a discount rating loomed high there, and it's still close to my heart. I can't answer the question about who has the authority. I do think we just have to act on our moral judgments there, and I think you and I would think everyone is a moral equal, irrespective of gender and class and race, and I add location in time. So that's why we go for a 0 pure time discount rate. You raised a very important question about investors and owners and also shareholders and employees in firms, and I didn't mention that at all, but not because they don't matter. And so I think we need to have an account of justice that respects their legitimate interests. But the key word there is legitimate, so they have to have legitimate expectations. And that doesn't mean that if I'm a slave owner and have 10 slaves that I'm entitled to keep on with 10 slaves. It does mean that if I'm going to introduce a policy that really imposes steep limits on people now, I should give them due warning. So really we need an account of justice to know when it's like the slave example where someone can't just say, well, can't we just wean it down from 10 slaves to 9 and then 8 and have sort of slow grandfathering. And other cases where Axel Gosseries gives one where the government, the day after when most people buy a car, suddenly slaps on a huge road tax for a certain kind of car. Then you could say, look, I would have done it differently if I'd been warned. That's a legitimate expectation. So, Chucks, I'll just say one thing and we can talk more. I only care about the right to extract insofar as it furthers some other valuable goals. There are some fossil fuels in the ground that can be used compatible with a 1.5 target. so I think it's legitimate to ask, can anyone use them, and if so, who? And why shouldn't it be the very poorest of the world if they benefit from it? That's my starting point. But if someone says no, they can benefit even more from clean technology, I say, okay, let's do that. So I don't think it's a similar vein to Fergus's. But I think of it practically. There's this stuff in the ground. It's pouring out. People are making money from it. You know, look at the figures for Ecuador. It's legitimate to ask, well, who can use that stuff, if anyone? And should we just keep it in the ground and pay people? Oh, and who pays? Well, we have an EU emissions trading scheme which auctions off and generates revenues. Henry over there might know better, well, he'll know better than I where the money goes for those revenues. Why shouldn't it go to this?
Okay, thank you to Simon.
Okay.
So we're at the end now, and I know everybody has to rush off to get taxis, but Chooks and I would like, and the students as well, I think, would like to thank all of you for being such brilliant guests of ours here at our launch event. I think it's been a great success. We've learned tons, and I know the students have benefited a lot as well. In particular, I'd like to thank Anne, who you've all had really involved in terms of Stella. Chooks, do you have any?
No, a big thank you to all of you. And let's do it again next year.
If I could,
Follow us on Twitter.
can I just encourage everyone to thank Catriona and Chucks as well for everything. So.